America has always had a hearty fascination for horror, not the kind of horror we see daily on the evening news, but rather the terror of the imagination. From Washington Irving's Headless Horseman to Wes Craven's Freddy Krueger, our culture has a seemingly insatiable need to be frightened. We read the books, and we watch the film adaptations of Stephen King and Clive Barker, and we just can't seem to get enough. Horror itself has become an industry. Among the masters of supernatural horror stands the Rhode Island author Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Though his works now receive worldwide acclaim and adulation as masterpieces of the genre, oddly, they were never published in book form in his lifetime. Today, his tales sell in the millions in a number of languages, and they have been continuously adapted to film since the 60s. Yet while his tales of terror have an international audience, the city of his birth is only now acknowledging the fact that this self-styled reclusive old gentleman from Providence is a literary figure of significant merit. As Providence celebrates the 100th birthday of Lovecraft, we invite you to join us on a walk through the city, his great love and inspiration throughout his life. Let us lead you through the real city he lived in, and then through the Providence of his imagination, where night things lurk and shadows hold unknown terrors.
Old Providence. It was this place and the mysterious forces of its long, continuous history which brought him back towards marvels and secrets whose boundaries no prophet could fix. Here lay the arcana. Wondrous or dreadful as the case may be, it was twilight, and Charles Dexter Ward had come home.
These lines are from the case of Charles Dexter Ward, one of H.P. Lovecraft's few novels, and he was also writing about his own glorious return to divine Providence after a dreadful 2-year exile in New York City during his marriage. In this story, he touches on the roots of his love for this small New England city and the quaint and splendid colonial architecture that he'd grown up in, and the permeating sense of history that he felt here, and also, yes, the subtle hints of decay that are indicative of ancient towns. And, well, let Lovecraft say it himself. I am Providence, and Providence is myself. Together, indissolubly as one, we stand through the ages. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in a large house that stood at this corner on Elm Grove Avenue and Angel Street. When his father was institutionalized for a severe nervous condition, his mother, Sarah, Susie Phillips, and he lived in that great home replete with an enormous library. Leading a secluded childhood, it was in books that Lovecraft let his imagination soar into the cosmos, or to Mount Olympus, or past wonders of Baghdad. He was a sickly child, doted on by his increasingly possessive mother, so his contacts with peers were minimal, a situation that continued throughout his life. But in the seclusion, his mind did not stagnate. His fascination with science led him to publish the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy at the ripe old age of 11. And he wrote juvenile fiction, some of which survives and remains in print today. A look at his childhood accomplishments prove him a gifted child. With the death of his grandfather, H.P.L. was forced to move in his early teens with his mother to these rented quarters at 598 Angel Street, where he continued to immerse himself in the classics, science, and his increasingly dark imagination. But he did get out, and was very out indeed when he visited the Lab Observatory on Doyle Avenue and gazed into the cosmos through the telescope, the cosmos that would later figure considerably in his writing. Because of real or imagined sickness, Lovecraft never finished high school nor engaged in the teenage rituals of boyhood. Never developing a normal social behavior, Lovecraft was throughout his 20s an arrested adolescent with little or no interest in sex, work, or sports. A very young hermit indeed. His mother was institutionalized in 1919, and with her death 2 years later in Butler Hospital for the Insane, Lovecraft began to emerge. And he also began his many explorations about the East Side, marveling at the Georgian architecture of Prospect Street, Power Street, and Angel.
His walks were always adventures in antiquity, during which he managed to recapture from the myriad relics of a glamorous old city a vivid and connected picture of the centuries before.
His affinity for such places and things led him to haunt the libraries and the Rhode Island Historical Society, digging out the history of Providence down to the most minute details. Some of these details he expertly infused in his fiction, giving it an authenticity and flavor now often imitated by writers. From these details, the writer gets a true feeling for Lovecraft's city, a feeling very close to reality. Here in this sequestered graveyard of St. John's Episcopal Church, Lovecraft would sit and dream up fascinating morbid tales, and imagine Edgar Allan Poe, his god of fiction, whiling away his day. Poe actually did visit this cemetery often on his visits to Providence. It's this area, this whole district, the College Hill district, that really was most meaningful to Lovecraft, and it was the history that he was able to fit himself into, and that he was able to fit into the shunned house, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, the Call of Cthulhu, all of this stuff that was really important to him, and that carried through into his creative output. Lovecraft joined amateur press clubs, and with the encouragement of his new circle of friends, he began his macabre writing. It was in the small, inexpensive pulp novels of the 20s and 30s, especially Weird Tales, that the author found his audience. Lovecraft declared his forte was in writing weird fiction, tales of supernatural horror along the lines of Poe, Dunsany, and Blackwood. And in those pulps he was quickly revered as a master of the genre. Beyond these garish, sexy covers, Lovecraft fine-tuned his genius for atmospheric description and terrifying mood. In weird tales, his genius shines brilliantly. As he ventured out into this new world, Lovecraft moved here to 10 Barnes Street, nearer the heart of the old city. Living with his maternal aunts, he began to meld his interest in Providence with his horror stories, writing the atmosphere he knew so well with the darkness of his own imagination. Here on Benevolent Street, Lovecraft first used Providence in fiction. It was up there on the ancient lonely house set back where Crawford Tillinghast, a scientist quite insane, had glimpsed beyond the bonds of infinity and drawn down demons from the stars, to quote Lovecraft. It was here Tillinghast ripped open the barriers between dimensions and let loose unimaginable horrors, only to meet his violent fate. But as Lovecraft's use of that lovely East Side Avenue was quite incidental, let us look at his next Providence-based tale, where the horror is very much a part of College Hill. It's this historical district that captivated Lovecraft, and it's the history of this very old, illustrious section of Providence that he integrated into his nightmare of fiction, The Shunned House. And this is the house, 133 Benefit Street, The Shunned House, where, mixing historical fact and his own morbid imaginings, he created a really splendid story of terror. He envisioned through these shuttered doors a subtle sickness, almost sickish, almost luminous exhalation that rose from the cellar floor. And the narrator, who was obsessed with the death and insanity the house imposed on its occupants, discovers the true reason for this terror, that it is that this house is supposed to have been erected on the gravesite of a vampire demon.
Out of the fungus-ridden earth steamed up a vaporous corpse light, yellow and diseased, which bubbled and lapped to a gigantic height in vague outlines half human and half monstrous. It was all eyes, wolfish and mocking, and the rugose insect-like head dissolved to a thin stream of mist.
Lovecraft moved to New York City and married Sonia Green, a fellow writer and self-made woman. He also attempted to make a success of himself, but at both attempts he failed miserably. He returned to Providence after a bitter but creatively productive 2 years. The couple soon divorced, and he returned to the life of a celibate gentleman. But he returned to his native city a man enraptured, renewed by its Yankee charm. He vowed never to move from Providence again and remained with his aunts until the end of his life. Lovecraft continued to refine his mastering of the horror genre and began a series of stories that has been called the Cthulhu mythos, horror tales that reveal man's insignificance against the forces of the old ones, great cosmic monsters bent on regaining control of our universe and are returning to the chaos of eons past. In that introductory short story, The Call of Cthulhu, or however you want to pronounce it, he based some of the action in this neighborhood. And here on Thomas Street, at number 7, the Fleur-de-Lis building, Henry Wilcox is supposed to have lived, and he's an unusually sensitive artist, and he's beset with fantastic, horrible dreams of the old ones calling for their resurrection, which call, if heeded, would enjoin man to revive the monsters.
Then the liberated old ones would teach humans new ways to shout and kill and enjoy themselves, and the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom.
The first chapters of Lovecraft's novel of doomed obsession and ageless demons, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, contains his most loving descriptions of Providence.
His home was a great Georgian mansion atop the well-nigh precipitous hill that rises just east of the river. Here he was born, and here his nurse first wheeled him in his carriage, past the little white farmhouse of 200 years before that the town had long overtaken, and along sleepy Congdon Street, one tier below the steep hill, the nurse used to stop and sit on the benches of Prospect Terrace. And one of the child's first memories was the great westward sea, of hazy roofs and domes and steeples and far hills which he saw from that great railed embankment, all violet and mystic against a fevered apocalyptic sunset of reds and golds and purples and curious greens. The vast marble dome of the State House stood out in massive silhouette, its crowning statue haloed fantastically by a break in one of the tinted stratus clouds that barred the flaming sky.
In the story, Ward is obsessed with antiquity, and especially with the bizarre life of his great-great-great-grandfather, the apparently immortal Joseph Curwen, immortal until the fathers of colonial Providence banded together to extinguish him, or so they believe. Curwen did return, and the horror swept Rhode Island once again. By the late 20s, Lovecraft was increasingly setting his stories in the mythical town of Arkham, Massachusetts. But still, elements of the City of Hope crept in, as with his oft-used Miskatonic University, a thinly veiled rendering of Brown University, the College of College Hill, and Rhode Island's most famous institution of learning. Called his own most fantastic creation, Lovecraft is a fascinating personality for study, and by any measure he was an accomplished writer. His limitations, as with most people, he placed on himself, and anyone would say that Lovecraft was, though a gracious and well-mannered gentleman, a very peculiar person. Generally, his views were, like his passions, antiquarian. Anything modern was abhorrent. All races save the whites were unworthy of high culture, and a gentleman, poor or not, did not work. He simply was. In these convictions, he was assuredly not ahead of his time, but in the small niche of supernatural horror writing, he most definitely was.
Life is a hideous thing, and from the background we know of it, peer demoniacal hints of truth which make it sometimes 1,000-fold more hideous. Science, already oppressive with its shocking revelations, will perhaps be the ultimate exterminator of our human species, for its reserve of unguessed horrors could never be borne by mortal brains if loosed upon the world.
These prophetic words were written decades before Hiroshima. Lovecraft took up his final residence in 1933. He continued to earn a meager income from revision, ghostwriting for Harry Houdini in the 20s, among others, and editing, but his fiction output dwindled significantly. Still, Lovecraft sold stories to Weird Tales and the science fiction pulp, Astounding Stories. Some of his work began to be collected in anthologies, his reputation slowly growing. It was up there in that corner room where Lovecraft wrote one of his last works, and in that very room was the setting for poor Robert Blake's awful death. Though Lovecraft earlier rarely set foot during city explorations out of the East Side, he did in later years, and in his final fictional references to the city, Federal Hill, one of Providence's new sections, figures. To Lovecraft, anything past 1750 was new. In this, the Italian neighborhood of Atwell's Avenue, Lovecraft imagined a fantastic creature living in the shadows up there, in the tower of St. John's Roman Catholic Church, where a monstrous evil had once dwelt and left its mark.
It was here young Robert Blake felt the terrible lure about the black and feigned, which was not to be resisted. In his compulsion, Blake revives the haunter of the dark, a nightmarish winged creature who waits for complete darkness to spring loose on the world, and Blake flees back to his College Street apartment. Here he sat through the summer, and his worst fears concerned himself, and a kind of unholy rapport he felt to exist between his mind and that lurking horror in the distant steeple. Then came the thunderstorm that knocked out the power, and the ensuing blackout, and the ripping open of the church's tower windows, and the sound of flapping wings, and a formless cloud of smoke that shot with meteor-like speed towards the east, towards a certain College Street apartment house.
To the very last, H.P. Lovecraft kept up his immense correspondence, so large, in fact, that his selected letters have been collected in 6 volumes. And in these he displayed all of his idiosyncrasies, not the least being his charm and selflessness. Some critics have complained that this superlative output was detrimental in that it took valuable time from his fiction writing and thusly decreased his income. But it's been argued that with so few acquaintances to talk shop with in Providence, letters were his way of conversing, and quite possibly, considering his occasional suicidal tendencies, a reason to stay alive. And it was these friends, his correspondents, fans, and devotees, who have kept the spirit of Lovecraft alive, and his work in print for new generations to enjoy as we have enjoyed it. The devotion and love these many people had and continue to have for Lovecraft cannot be underestimated in the ever-growing legacy of Lovecraft. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died on the Ides of March, the 15th of the month, in 1937 of intestinal cancer in the Jane Brown Memorial Hospital in Providence. His legacy remains his published fiction and letters, his fascinating personality, and the distinction of being one of the city's most famous natives. And yet the city he so warmly embraced has been slow to recognize his importance. In what has been considered his finest story, The Outsider, Lovecraft wrote, "I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men." It was after his death that his writing gained the widespread readership and acclaim that had for so long eluded him. Through the efforts of his many friends, especially August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, Lovecraft's work was finally collected, and his influence rose dramatically. This book, the Armed Services edition of the Dunwich Horror, had a significant impact on his growing popularity, as thousands of World War II U.S. military personnel read it during their overseas assignments, and they came home demanding more. And they did get more, as his work was published in a trickle at first, and then in numerous paperback editions commencing in the 60s, and since then his work has rarely been out of print. And that his writing is considered more than pure entertainment is indicated by its having been the subject of academic journals, theses, and college courses. Here in the John Hay Library at Brown University, devotees and students of Lovecraft come to study the vast collection, his handwritten manuscripts, the correspondence, the memorabilia, the vast body of his life's work. But his spirit is less here than outside in the streets of Providence. Here, the area is much as it was in his day, and from the world over the curious come to tour through his beloved town, and they remember him at his gravesite in Swan Point Cemetery, commemorating his spirit and thanking him for his gifted writing. To many, Lovecraft is Providence, and he is quite worthy of the city's commemoration and respect. In Providence, Lovecraft will always live.